we may finally be at a tipping point in the White House's policy on how they treat Russia and how they treat Ukraine in these negotiations. Because as President Trump has said, kind of the one consistent message he's had over the past several months is that he does want a real peace here. And now he might finally be realizing what he has to do to pressure Russia to get to that peace.
Now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin will not travel to Turkey for peace talks on the war in Ukraine tomorrow, despite calls from Ukraine's President Zelensky for him to attend. Russia's delegation at the talks tomorrow in Istanbul will instead be headed by presidential aide Vladimir Medinsky. That's according to a statement from the Kremlin. President Zelensky had previously said he would attend the talks and meet Putin in person if the Russian president agreed. Well, Andrew Dianieri is a resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, who served in the Peace Corps in Ukraine. Good evening, Andrew.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
Where do you think this leaves those talks in Turkey tomorrow?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting how this has all come together. We saw President Zelensky earlier this week, after talking with European leaders and in consultation with President Trump, again demand a 30-day ceasefire, unconditional, in Ukraine. And President Trump publicly supported exactly that. President Putin responded by saying, no, actually, we should discuss this bilaterally in Istanbul on Thursday. And President Zelensky said, great, let's do it. And then President Putin backed off even after President Trump dangled his own attendance. So we're going to see tomorrow probably working level teams, certainly from the Russian side, and that's putting it kindly, with something led by Mr. Medinsky, who's quite a Ukrainophobe in some circles, is seen as really, really virulently anti-Ukrainian. And we'll also see on the US side all three poles of where President Trump's policy has been on Ukraine and on Russia. We'll have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's been kind of in the middle, and then General Kellogg, who's been working with the Ukrainian side, will be on one end, and we'll also have Mr. Witkoff, who's been romancing folks in Moscow over the past several weeks. So it'll be a really interesting day of talks between the Ukrainians and the Russian side, and with the U.S. also there. I'm not confident we'll see any breakthroughs, however.
Yeah, I mean, normally you wouldn't have a meeting between two presidents until all the groundwork had been laid anyway. Do you think there is the prospect of any significant progress tomorrow, given that, I mean, fundamentally, right up until now, President Putin hasn't really shown any indication that he actually wants to end the war?
Well, this is absolutely the right question, and frankly, the ball is in Washington's court on this. I mean, we see not only Ukraine, but the major European countries, the UK, Germany, France, even Poland, and now plus the United States talking about an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. And even the Chinese Foreign Ministry supporting something like this, saying that they're open to all avenues toward peace. And it's really the Russian side holding out. And so I think it's incumbent upon the United States, which has a lot of leverage. It can still levy upon Moscow in the form of new, tougher sanctions, and including additional military aid to Ukraine. If they look like they might move on either one of those or both, that is something that could compel the Kremlin to seriously think about peace, which they've really studiously declined to do over the past several months, despite making appearances that they're open to negotiations and peace.
And do you think that President Trump would be prepared to take those sorts of moves to impose sanctions? He has expressed some frustration at President Putin, but throughout all of this, he sounded rather too ready to listen to the Russian leader.
Well, as President Trump might say, the U.S. has all of the cards here. There's a lot of things they can do. We have Senator Graham's bill that's sitting in the Senate right now about massive sanctions on Russia, on Russian oil. We have lots of U.S. Stocks and European stocks that can be released and sent to Ukraine in the form of long-range weapons. There's some artillery that can be sent. And of course, there's more funding that can be done for Ukraine's own drone program, which is really kind of the force on the battlefield right now. Um, I was just in Kyiv last week, and Ukrainians are hopeful that President Trump is finally seeing that it's actually not so easy to negotiate with the Russians, that uh, giving unilateral promises to the Russians doesn't compel them to the table. It only allows them to extract, excuse me, more concessions. So I think we may finally be at a tipping point in the White House's policy on how they treat Russia and how they treat Ukraine in these negotiations. Because as President Trump has said, kind of the one consistent message he's had over the past several months is that he does want a real peace here. And now he might finally be realizing what he has to do to pressure Russia to get to that peace.
What happens to President Zelensky tomorrow then? Does he still go to Turkey? Presumably he wouldn't want to attend the talks if President Putin is not going to be there.
Yeah, I mean, President Zelensky has said he won't attend unless President Putin also attends. So I think it's highly unlikely that we'll see Zelensky in a public forum or at negotiations per se in Turkey. And I think one interesting piece here is everyone was waiting what kind of delegation to see what kind of delegation the Russians would send, and the fact that they're sending this kind of low-level delegation also could be a move to deter President Trump from attending. If it was a little bit higher level, we might have seen more higher level involvement from the US side. And with it being now at a really kind of mid-level working level, certainly there won't be any major high-level US participation. So I think it'll be kind of ministerial level on the Ukrainian side and kind of the advisor level on the Russian side.
And President Zelensky has done a lot, hasn't he, to build bridges with the US president since that bust up in the White House?
Absolutely. Like I said, I was in Kyiv last week when the Ukrainian parliament ratified the critical minerals deal, the natural resources deal that had long been bandied about between Ukraine and the United States, which is a big win for President Trump. That's something he can take back and say, we're now investing in Ukraine, but we're also getting a lot back from the Ukrainians. So I think things like that symbolically do a lot to bring the relationship back to normal. And General Kellogg and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have also done a lot at the ministerial level, the secretary level, to coalesce the US and Ukrainian positions, along with European allies, around a position toward getting first a ceasefire and then real peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. So there's been a lot of ground made up in the past just several weeks.
Andrew Danieri, resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre and who served in the Peace Corps in Ukraine. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
You're listening to Carol Walker on Times Radio.